Two patrol cars rolled to the curb and stopped without sirens. Blue lights flickered across the trimmed lawns of Crestwood Manor, turning an ordinary Saturday into something sharp and unstable. Judith Pennington rushed toward the officers in a dark pink blazer, her face strained with panic, her arm cutting through the air as she pointed toward the porch. Franklin Ferris stood there with his wife and their dog, motionless in the heat, looking less like a suspect and more like a man trying not to react too soon. Denise Ferris, golden curls pulled softly around her face, held a peace lily close to her chest, and Bruno stayed low at her feet, calm but alert. Judith had already built her story. By the time the officers stepped out of the vehicles, she had decided what they were supposed to believe. In her version, Franklin and Denise were trespassers. In her version, the dog was dangerous. In her version, the house behind them belonged to someone else. But the scene in front of the officers told a different story. Moving boxes sat on the porch. Open packing tape caught the sunlight. The house number matched the paperwork Franklin had already handed over. Nothing looked like a break. Everything looked like a family moving into the home they had just bought. The senior officer studied Franklin's identification, then the address, then the front of the house. His posture changed first. Then his expression changed. The suspicion that had entered the yard with the patrol car started to give way to careful recognition. When the officer addressed Franklin with visible respect, Judith's certainty began to collapse. She had not stopped a trespasser. She had accused the wrong man in the wrong yard, and the truth was about to become public. 3 hours earlier, Crestwood Manor had looked exactly like the kind of place people describe when they want to sound lucky. Stone front homes lined the street. Hedges were trimmed into perfect edges. The lawns were clean, wide, and green, as if the whole neighborhood had been designed to reassure strangers. At the entrance, a brass plaque marked the community like a promise. Quiet streets, good schools, strong property values. The kind of place where people assumed that if something looked neat, it must also be fair. Franklin and Denise Ferris had arrived with a pickup truck, a sedan, and the excitement that comes with finally closing the door on rented spaces and opening it on something permanent. Franklin was 42, broad, shouldered, practical, and calm in the way of a man who had spent years building a life through discipline. Denise was 39, warm and expressive, with shoulder-length golden curls and the kind of smile that suggested she had already imagined where every plant would go in the yard. Their first home together was not a dream on paper anymore. It was a real porch, a real driveway, and a real set of keys in Franklin's pocket. Bruno rode in the truck like a loyal guard, his head out the window as the wheels turned into the neighborhood. Denise had picked Crestwood Manor because she wanted trees, sidewalks, and enough distance from the highway to hear birds instead of traffic. Franklin had handled the closing, the title work, and every detail with steady focus. Nothing about the purchase was careless. Nothing about it was hidden. They had earned this day. Across the street, Judith Pennington had already begun watching. She had lived in the neighborhood for decades and served as president of the Homeowners Association for nearly as long. Her authority in Crestwood Manor came less from a title than from habit. People listened because she expected them to. They deferred because it was easier than pushing back. When the moving truck stopped at 14 Maple Ridge Court without her knowledge, she took it personally. When the new owners stepped out and happened to be a black couple, she treated her personal offense like a neighborhood emergency. Judith crossed the street with the controlled urgency of someone who already believed she had the upper hand. She started with the house, then the dog, then the paperwork, and finally the people themselves. Her questions came dressed as policy, but the shape of the attack was easy to read. She demanded homeowners association forms that had never been mentioned during closing. She wanted pet registration, background checks, approval review, and financial disclosure. Every request carried the same message underneath it. She did not think they belonged there until she personally decided they did. Franklin answered with patience and kept moving boxes inside. Denise tried to stay polite, then tried to stay calm, then tried to stay composed when it became obvious that Judith was not there to understand anything. Judith kept scanning the truck bed, the porch, the dog, the potted plant, the couple's clothes, and the moving labels as though she were collecting proof of a problem. She was not confused. She was committed. By late morning, she had taken her concern to the neighborhood group chat, warning residents about unknown occupants who had not been vetted. No one needed the missing language spelled out. The message was clear enough. Soon, People on the block began to watch from porches and windows. One neighbor stood at a mailbox and stared for so long that it no longer looked like curiosity. It looked like agreement. Another neighbor turned away when Denise met her eyes and offered a small, hopeful smile. Denise tried one gesture of kindness by carrying a cutting from her peace lily across the street, hoping a simple hello might soften the morning. It did not. The door closed quietly, and that quiet carried more weight than shouting ever could. Judith returned with more forms, more demands, and more confidence. By then, conflict was no longer about paperwork. It was about power. And Judith was determined to make new family feel full weight of her disapproval. As the afternoon heat rose, so did the pressure. Judith stopped behaving like a concerned neighbor and started acting like the gatekeeper of the entire block. She complained about Bruno's size even though he had barely made a sound. She described him as unregistered and unsafe before anyone official had reviewed a thing. She told the street that Franklin and Denise were occupying the house without proper clearance, as though a private sale could be canceled by gossip and repetition. Franklin kept carrying boxes. Denise kept opening cabinets and placing dishes inside them. Bruno stayed close, tracking every movement on the street with the patient focus of a dog who understood that his family felt watched. The neighborhood, meanwhile, began to fold around Judith's version of events. A man at the corner leaned into his phone while staring at the house. A woman across the street stood still at her fence. A third neighbor watched from a driveway with the blank expression of someone trying not to become involved while still choosing a side. Judith returned once more and moved closer to the porch. Her phone lifted, her frustration no longer hidden behind courtesy. Bruno reacted to the movement with a single bark when she pressed too close to the glass. It was a startled warning. Nothing more. But Judith saw the opening she had been waiting for. She recoiled, stumbled near the curb, and turned a small misstep into a dramatic injury. Her body language changed instantly, becoming loud enough to dominate the street. The scene had shifted from rude interference to public accusation. Franklin had not moved. Denise knew that. Bruno knew that. But the watching neighbors were beginning to act as though the story Judith was telling had more authority than the reality standing in front of them. That was the danger now. Not just the lie, but the willingness of other people to help it survive long enough to cause damage. Judith's next move was the one that changed everything. She sat near the curb, clutching her knee, and used her phone to call emergency services. Her report was fast, polished, and deliberately alarming. She claimed trespassing. She claimed assault. She claimed the dog had attacked. She claimed Franklin had shoved her from the porch. The story had been shaped to sound urgent, and the urgency was what made it dangerous. Franklin understood the risk immediately. Denise understood it too, and fear moved across her face the moment she realized how quickly an ordinary neighborhood dispute could become something far more serious for a black man standing on his own property. Franklin placed his hands where everyone could see them and stayed still. He knew that movement could be misread, and he knew that misread moments had ruined lives before. The yard became a waiting room for consequences. The heat sat heavy on the grass. Cicadas screamed in the trees. Sprinklers clicked off down the block, and the sudden quiet made the street feel even more exposed. Judith kept crying at the curb, still performing for anyone who might later describe what they saw in a way that protected her. The neighbors remained scattered at the edge of the lawn, silent and uncertain, as if silence could insulate them from responsibility. Denise could feel the minutes stretching. Bruno pressed close behind the glass, whimpering softly at the tension outside. The fear in the house became physical. It settled into their shoulders, their breathing, and the space between every glance. Franklin stood calm. But calm is not the same as safe. The officers were on their way, and everyone on the block knew the next 15 minutes could decide whether the truth would matter or not. When the officers arrived, Judith surged forward instantly, tears already in place. Every gesture aimed at turning herself into the victim before anyone could ask a question. She pointed toward the porch and repeated the story she had prepared. But the senior officer did not rush to judgment. He looked at the couple. He looked at the boxes. He looked at the dog. He looked at the house number. Then he asked for Franklin's identification. Franklin moved slowly and kept his hands visible as he reached for his wallet. The officer checked the license, the address, and the city record, then checked them again. Something changed in the way he stood. The suspicion that had arrived with the cruiser faded into something more careful and more respectful. The officer stepped back, conferred with his partner, and returned with a completely different tone. Then came the moment that broke the street open. The officer recognized Franklin not as a stranger, but as the mayor of the city. The title landed in the air with such force that even the neighbors seemed to stop breathing. Judith's face drained of color. The confidence she had carried all day vanished. Denise froze beside Franklin, stunned by the speed of the reversal. Bruno stayed calm at their feet, the only one who still looked settled in the scene. The officers reviewed the facts, and the facts did not favor Judith. There was no break in, there was no assault. The dog had not attacked anyone. The false narrative she had built began to unravel in real time. The officer documented her statement, noted the contradictions, and prepared the citation for filing a false report. The neighbor who had echoed her story earlier suddenly looked at the ground. Another stepped backward. The street that had been so eager to watch now wanted to disappear. By the next morning, the story had already begun to travel. The police report became public record. A neighbor's video preserved the exact moment. Franklin stood still while Judith tried to sell her version of events. The footage erased any remaining doubt. It showed a man on his own porch, hands visible, refusing to move. It showed a woman trying to convert embarrassment into a crime. It showed a neighborhood that had watched, judged, and said too little. The Homeowners Association called an emergency meeting and removed Judith from leadership. The city opened a broader review. And what came out over the following days was worse than a single bad afternoon. The pattern had existed before. Families had been delayed, questioned, and discouraged through excessive demands that never seemed to apply to everyone equally. It was not a mistake repeated once. It was a system that had stayed hidden because too many people found it easier not to look too closely. Judith faced charges for filing a false report and misusing emergency services. The witness who backed her story had to account for that too. The association was forced to publish its meetings, remove its secret vetting process, and adopt rules that matched fair housing standards. What had once felt like a polished neighborhood image was now being rebuilt into something more honest. Months later, Crestwood Manor felt different. New families moved in without being treated like intruders. Neighbors carried boxes instead of suspicion. The entrance plaque was replaced with one that welcomed everyone. Franklin stayed in office, but he never needed to boast about what happened. Denise planted flowers along the walkway, and Bruno claimed the backyard like it had always been his. The house at 14 Maple Ridge Court settled into peace, and that is what made the whole story linger. Judith thought she was defending standards. She ended up exposing her own character. The street thought silence would keep things comfortable. Instead, silence became part of the damage. Franklin and Denise never needed permission to belong. The real question is whether the people watching would have done more than stand there and look away.